So for those of you who don't know, the Free Education Planning Group was constituted as a result of the agreement which was signed between the university and students last year. One of the aspects or one of the clauses of the agreement was for the university to investigate possible funding models for free education. So as an attempt to actualize and bring into fruition that aspect of the agreement, we have undertaken to do some research, and what we're going to present to you are some of the 6 funding sources to fund free education that have been identified by the research team, but also to open up the space to hear input, critique, opinion, and to have the debate around some of the questions which surround free education. So should it be free education for all, or is it free education for the poor? Who should pay and where's the money going to come from? Are those models going to be sustainable? Those are the debates that we're hoping to open up and allow for more input going forward, so that when there's an inevitable fee increase, there can be some understanding or some idea of what we want to achieve, of what we want ourselves as a university to stand behind and rally for. So I'm going to hand over to Iksan, who's the co-chair of the planning group alongside myself, and Gula Mudak, who isn't here, and he's also the chair of the research unit which led the investigation into the funding models. And he's going to talk briefly and just give a brief introduction as to what the different options are, and then we'll open up the space for discussion and critique. So that'll be 10 minutes just to give a quick overview of what the funding options are. There are booklets on some of your seats, so you can quickly turn to page 20 and you'll see the table of summary of the different funding options. Cool.
So last year, we saw a very intentional response by the state and the university, saying that the response to protests, despite the historic kind of gains that we've made and contributed to the country, the response is going to be some combination of securitization and a model put forward by the government. This model does not address most of the concerns that have come forward, and this is really why we've come forward with this research, and we're trying to come to an agreement well ahead of time so that we can mobilize strongly on a unanimous platform towards achieving some kind of progress. And there are 3 points that emerge from the kind of research that we did, and there are 3 basic points. The one point is that fees excludes poor black students. If you go to if you think over the last few years, between 2007 and 2012, you had fee increases across universities of about 14% or 8% in real terms. Every year, year on year, 14% increases. And who did that hit? If you look at the booklet and you go to page 11, you can see over here that for people earning below 120,000 Rand, who were theoretically supposed to be covered by NSFAS, many of these people were excluded, were simply denied funding from NSFAS. The NSFAS system is broken. There's underfunding, people do not get enough funding, and people are still rejected even though you qualify for NSFAS. But moreover, if you look at that graph on the second half of page 11, we know that 70% of this country earns below the household income threshold of 120,000 Rand, which theoretically should give you fees covered by the financial aid system, NSFAS. And yet only 25% of our university students are covered. So there's a lot of students that should be in this university that aren't and are excluded because of the various systems, including because of the financial barriers. Then even when you make it into university, if you look on page 13 of the booklet, on page 14 of the booklet, even when you make it into university, poorer students have a much higher dropout rate of about 60%. And that's a combination of the fact that poorer students have to perform their poverty in front of various NSFAS committees and forms, there's debt slavery, and there's black tax. All these things put on pressure on poor students to increase the dropout rates. So that's the first point, that fees excludes poorer black students. Secondly, when we talk about free decolonized education, it's not just fees that is excluding. And there's a necessity to decolonize the higher education system in its entirety. If you see on page 12 and on page 13 of the booklet, it becomes clear that the entire higher education system from colonial times to now has been engineered towards reproducing a very small, mostly white elite, and to keep poor black masses trapped and unable to access the higher education system. This needs to be decolonized. And this also extends beyond the higher education system into basic education. So if you go to page 11, you see that on average, for the poorest 60% of schools, so most schools in the country, a learner in grade 9 is actually, in terms of learning ability, only in grade 4. And so when we talk about free decolonized education, it's a decolonization that has to extend throughout the higher education system, that addresses the inequalities between universities, that addresses the basic education system and the broader inequalities in our society, and that takes seriously issues such as decommodification. The curriculum that we learn at our university, the languages we speak in, the social relationships. How is it that the workers who clean our classrooms are not able to learn in the same classrooms? How is it that we have a university that's supposed to be public, like UCT, and you had at the start of 2016 a shack being destroyed on the university property? We have inspiring examples across the world, such as Marcus Garvey University and other universities in Argentina and Brazil that have pursued programs that really integrate the higher education system within the community instead of on a mountain as we have here, and that are truly open, public, and decommodified. And so what has the government's response been to this? It's been to propose a model called ISFAP, which doesn't take seriously at all the call for decolonization. It perpetuates the same decommodification and doesn't deconstruct any of those things. And in fact, it's just NSFAS basically boosted. It's with a greater loan and grant scheme up to a higher threshold. Moreover, our analysis shows that what ISFAP is promising, that more students will be covered under this new financial aid system, is unlikely to arise. It's unlikely that the government is able to get this funding, because what they're essentially relying on is going to be voluntary donations from corporates, which we are very skeptical will come forward. And so this is the third point, that we need to organize and mobilize and think hard about what kind of model in these forums and going forward we are in support of. And the kind of models we looked at are to think about the impact on the higher education sector, but on the government and society in general. On the implementation, because it must be a smooth implementation. That it takes redress seriously. You can't have a higher education system that perpetuates the inequalities. And lastly, that has a vision for society where in the future we can work towards decolonization. And so we identify 6 sources of funding and assess them on these criteria. A couple of sources of funding are as follows. One source of funding is government funding. And really important here is that when we talk about government funding for the higher education sector, we are not talking about taking away funding from healthcare or taking away from housing or basic education. This funding comes out of a tax increase, for example. And in fact, we've had a massive tax break given, for example, to corporates over the last few years. Corporate tax has decreased by 7% just in the year 2012, from 35% to 28%. In fact, if we just took back half of that, if we increase corporate tax again by 3%, we'd be able to have fee-free education. If you instituted a corporate graduate tax, corporates could pay an equivalent amount proportional to the number of graduates they have in the corporations. Another source of funding is community service, that people who graduate must go into communities so that we truly see our education as a public education, and that will help pursue our aims of decommodification of curricula and otherwise, and how we conceptualize of education. A graduate tax, we worked out if people earning above 300,000 Rand who benefited from the higher education system were to pay simply 1 to 2% of their salary, that could cover full cost of study education. And that table is on page 17 of the booklet, or 18. This graduate tax could take into account black tax by decreasing the amount of tax required by first-generation graduates, for example. And then there's the income contingent loans. Income contingent loans are similar to what NSFAS currently has. It could be a universally guaranteed income contingent loan where banks no longer reject students. However, there are many problems with this approach, as we see in the current system of NSFAS, and as we will see with ISFAP. The problems of debt slavery remain, the problems of performing poverty, and all the other problems associated with NSFAS. And lastly, there's the option of fees restructuring, where the most highly paid pay a lot more and the lowest paid pay less. A problem with this system is that inherently depends on the fact that you must have a large proportion of your university students coming from a higher or wealthier households. If you have a truly democratic education system, this system suddenly becomes unsustainable, and so it's anti our aims of democratizing education. And so to end off, we have many models, and we should be discussing them and going through them. And importantly, there are important gains to make. In fact, there's agreement across even management and students and government that at a minimum, we need to make sure that there are no financial barriers to higher education. There's agreement that student debt is bad, and there's a lot of agreement on some kind of model, including, for example, that corporates should be paying more, and other models such as the graduate tax. These are still contested, but we need to be coming together and having these discussions. And so to end off, when we talk about free decolonized education, we need to be having this discussion with all these criteria in mind. Impact, redress, vision, and implementation, and never forgetting that free education only makes sense in the context of free decolonized education. So we're ending off there, and we'd like to launch into a discussion where if anyone has any comments, questions, ideas, please come forward, and there's a roaming mic, and please give your thoughts. So we can take a round of questions. And by no means am I going to answer these questions. This is a discussion.
Very good afternoon. I am Sibonise Kilichana, the chair for international students in SRC. So with this model, like how far does it reach in terms of SADC students, or even this whole notion of African students being like alienated from the South African context and conversation? So is it inclusive of African students outside of these SADC borders, or all these things? You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Do I have
Let's take
that?
a few comments.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rorisang Musedi. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for creating this platform and this discussion. I think it's very useful, and this booklet is quite a great document. Ihsan, you mentioned quite a number of different principles and philosophies that need to be bear in mind, but one thing that I didn't hear from you is sustainability. And I think given where we are as a country, I mean, it's an important consideration and factor that we need to speak about, given the fact that we're dealing with such large inequalities. You know, you had mentioned in your remarks the issue of, I mean, reduced company tax. I share some of your frustrations. But we're also met, you know, one, we can't deny the fact that we do live in a very particular economic paradigm across the world, which is largely free market and capitalist. So we can't really be daft we've got to balance our social endeavors with some kind of market incoming, right? So my one question is, how do we drive growth? I mean, given the fact that our country's in junk status, how do we ensure that the fiscus can support and sustain a free education system? I think when we look across the continent, if we look at what's happened in Uganda, we look at universities like Makerere, we see sort of what happens when we don't think about sustainability as a central principle. And I didn't hear much development or argument and consideration from you in at least your remarks. Of course, we haven't gone through the booklet, and I'm sure the booklet has some thoughts on that. And what is your, I mean, increasing company tax is one thing, but that's not a sustainable thing given the fact that, you know, companies can up and leave this country, as we're already seeing in Port Elizabeth with workers losing, you know, thousands of workers losing their jobs because of multinationals. So how do we protect ourselves against those shocks? How do we make this a sustainable thing on the fiscus? And how do we drive some level of growth, however you interpret it? Because we want our institutions to not necessarily just remain as they are, but to become better and even more prevalent as we're pushing forward this decolonization and decolonial practice and theory and creating our own knowledges. We want to develop a canon, but we can't develop a canon if we don't have resources to do so. So I think that for me has always been my attention, and I'm just trying to understand what your thoughts are, and perhaps what everyone else's thoughts are, having considered